Well, okay, as we continue on to chapter 2, we are now going to move into the focus on the human nervous system. And we're going to start with just some basic anatomy and physiology of the nervous system, so that as we go further into this, further into the course, some of these basics of the anatomy and functioning of the nervous system will be sort of part of your basic knowledge here. See if I can make this work. Okay, go ahead. There we go. So first thing we want to talk about is the basic functions. So it's part of the physiological side a little bit of the nervous system. And this kind of connects back to a lot of things covered in chapter 1, right? The idea is that the reason we have a nervous system is to be able to control the movement of our bodies, but also to, of course, sense the environment. So we need to bring in that sensory information and integrate it across all of our 5 senses. And then, of course, using that directly in the control of movement is what we tend to call sensory motor control. That's a large area of research in neuroscience and psychology. And of course, something else that we mentioned in the previous chapter is the importance of learning, those flexible behaviors where we need the cortex in particular. This is where we're going to be focusing. The bulk of the material in this course is about what happens in the cortex. And that is all about learning and flexibility and adaptability, or the key word here when it comes to talking about brains is plasticity, or maybe neuroplasticity. And what we're talking about here is plastic is really just a metaphor for something that is changeable, adaptable, malleable, whatever you want to call it. But the brain needs to be able to adapt, of course, adapting to changing circumstances and to new experiences and new life events is an important part of the brain's ability to adapt. And of course, built into the way in which neurons, the nerve cells in the brain, as well as the synapses, the connections between the nerve cells, is that it allows them to change both physically and chemically. And it's also worth pointing out that the brain has the ability to compensate in the case of injury. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but for some of us it may, and therefore the ability of the brain to adapt not just to changes in external circumstances, but to changes in internal functioning as a result of injury is part of the broader concept of plasticity. Well, here is one way of visualizing the organization of the nervous system. This is a classic breakdown where we're going to think of the nervous system as being first composed of 2 core subsystems, the CNS or central nervous system, and the PNS or peripheral nervous system. And then we can further break those down. The central nervous system is really the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system, on the other hand, is broken out into the somatic and autonomic nervous systems, respectively. Now, there's several, maybe some debates about the validity of this way of subdividing the nervous system. Primarily, it's one that is driven a lot by, I guess, what we could call anatomical convenience. That is, when we look at the nervous system, it's really obvious at an anatomical level to be able to see, oh yeah, the brain and the spinal cord are these really big things right in the central part of the nervous system. And then you have all these nerves that branch off peripherally from that. So that's why we see that kind of CNS versus PNS breakdown. But we might also think that within the PNS, those 2 subparts of it really are different functionally. And so if we wanted to just, instead of looking at the nervous system anatomically, but we want to break it down more at a functional level, we might reorganize our chart a little bit, right? And there's nothing new here. It's just sort of treating the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems as being a little bit more on that higher level of functioning. So, of course, the central nervous system, or CNS, is still the same. It contains the brain and spinal cord, but we also think about what is its function. And the function is, maybe we could talk about mediating, right? What are we talking about here? Well, in the previous chapter, when we talked about the evolution of nervous systems, we talked about how sensing neurons and motor neurons were part of the very earliest nervous systems, and that when early brains, such as the ones that contain simplistic brains called a ganglion, had evolved, the function is that in those ganglions, those contain neurons that were neither sensory nor motor neurons, and instead were just regular neurons that processed information, and they were somehow mediating between the sensory input and the motor output. And so now what we're going to say here is that the brain and the spinal cord, as the CNS, really is just a big complex version of that. What else is going on in the peripheral nervous system, though? We have that somatic nervous system, as I mentioned. Well, this is where you find the sensory motor stuff. So the somatic nervous system includes sensory inputs to the central nervous system, and those come in anatomically through either the cranial nerves or the spinal nerves. We'll talk more, we'll get some pictures for those. So we've got nerves that feed into the spine, that bring sensory input into the spine, and then it goes up the spine, up through the brainstem and into the cortex. We also have cranial nerves. Cranial nerves are coming in from nerves of the skin of the face, but also nerves coming from the eyes, the ears. Those are all within the head, and therefore those are all considered cranial nerves. And those all feed into the brainstem, which then goes up into the brain. Also part of the peripheral nervous system, though, we see listed is the autonomic nervous system. And here we want to, again, think about its function. This is a series of peripheral nerves that connect into the spine and brainstem. But the difference here is functionally, this connects to the control of our internal organs. So we're going to think here about our classic intro psych, what you learn about the division between the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. The sympathetic is your fight or flight response, the arousal system, and the parasympathetic is your rest and digest system. Let's pause here and learn some anatomical terms while we're at it here. So this is going to be useful to have at our disposal when we talk about different parts of the nervous system, and including the brain, is there are a lot of anatomy terms that relate to positioning within the nervous system. So whether something is near the front or back or top or bottom or left or right, there are specific terms for that. And so what we see here, at least in referencing the brain, is anything that is near to the front of the brain or is in front of another location is called anterior, right? So one part of the brain could be anterior to another part, and that means in relation to the other part, it is towards the front of the brain and to the front of that organ. Posterior is behind or in the back. Another breakdown relates to the left and right division, and so that relates to medial versus lateral. So medial is something that is closer to the middle or midline of the brain. Lateral is something towards the sides. This, again, is sometimes used in a relational way. So you could have an organ that sits medial in relation to another organ within the brain. So you could say, for example, that the hippocampus sits medial to the temporal lobe, meaning that the hippocampus is closer to the midline compared to the temporal lobe. Likewise, dorsal and lateral here refers to top and bottom. Now, this is going to be a little bit confusing because when we look at other parts of the nervous system, did I say dorsal and lateral? I meant dorsal and ventral. I hope I said that. In the case of the brain, dorsal does sort of refer to the top of the brain and ventral to the bottom of the brain. But in a more technical sense, and that's, of course, exactly what it says on the slide, dorsal refers to back and ventral usually refers to belly side. And so, of course, the ventral side of the brain is closer to our bellies, even though we don't normally think of the proximity of the brain to our belly. This is relevant because there are other times when we might talk about the spinal cord. And the spinal cord has a dorsal and a ventral side, but it's not about top and bottom as much as it is, again, if you think about the spinal cord being a vertical cord, the side that is on the actual back side of our back and our backbone is the dorsal part of the spine. And the part that sits towards the front of the spine that's closer to the internal organs and belly is considered the ventral part of the spine. So that is likely to be somewhat confusing, how we'll use these terms somewhat differently depending on whether we're talking about the brain or the spine. Another way that we might talk about anatomical terms for the brain is to talk about doing sections or cross sections of the brain. And so what we want to do is we want to think about defining 3 planes, right? So a plane, if you see me in the picture here, can either be a horizontal plane or a vertical plane, right? But of course, when we talk about certain vertical planes, it also depends on the orientation. So if we imagine a plane that intersects the brain in a way that crosses the midline of the brain, so that would be something like you see my hand like this right in front of my face, that's called a coronal section, right? And it gives us a view of the brain that is referred to as a frontal view, because there's also a name called the frontal plane. And the frontal plane is any plane that goes in that same coronal direction. Now, if we rotate to a horizontal plane, we're taking a horizontal section of the brain now, we get a view that is sometimes referred to as a dorsal view, because in this case, we are looking down from above. Is the way we want to think about this particular image. And so because we're looking down from the dorsal side, the back side, the top side of the brain, we're going to call that a dorsal view of the brain. Now, on the other hand, if we cut a different sort of vertically oriented plane, but instead of cutting across the frontal plane like this, we're going to cut down the middle of the brain, left and right symmetry, then we are taking a sagittal view, sagittal section. Right. And so we can talk about the sagittal plane or the medial plane being the plane that kind of cuts left and right between the 2 halves of the brain. So that's what we see when we take a sagittal section, as we get this medial view of the brain, seeing it in this kind of cross section from the side. Good to just have these terms down so that when you encounter them in various locations throughout the book and in the lectures, you will understand what these words mean. A brief overview of some of what we might call the external surface features. We got the skull, of course, which is the cranium, the bone that protects the brain. Beneath the skull is a layer of tissue known as the meninges. Contains some blood vessels and cushioning. And then we have a space, an actual gap between the meninges and the cortex itself, and it's filled with fluid. This is called the subarachnoid space. The reason it's referred to that, the spider word arachnoid, is because the vessels and tissues of the meninges kind of look like a spider web, right? And so it's referred to in a way that refers to the spiders. And so below that then would be the subarachnoid space. And it's filled with fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. So this fluid helps provide a nice cushion for the brain so that the brain doesn't bounce up against the interior of the skull. That's not a good thing. What can happen if we have a head injury, if it's like in a concussion or even something more serious, is the brain actually bounces around a little bit inside the cranium and strikes up against the interior of the skull and meninges, and that can cause some damage to the brain. It can cause some swelling, inflammation, bleeding. That's called a hematoma. So we don't want that to happen. So in a usual case, outside of those extreme cases where we have a very severe blow to the head, the cerebrospinal fluid helps provide some cushioning. Of course, the interior of the brain has some empty spaces known as ventricles, which are also full of CSF. And the interior of the spinal cord also is full of CSF. The cerebrum refers here to the cortex, what we think of as the folded cortex. The folds are called gyri and sulci, right? So the gyri would be the actual sort of protruding convex parts of the brain, and the sulci would be the creases and folds between them. The cerebrum is divided into 4 lobes, which you may remember from an intro psych course: the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes of the brain. And then below the cerebrum, we find the brainstem, which Can include also the cerebellum. Here is a picture. I'm not going to linger over a lot of these pictures in this lecture because the book is full of pictures like this, and you can sort of refer to these as you need. You're going to want to make sure, though, that you are becoming fairly comfortable with these kinds of pictures so that you can identify frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, temporal. We see them all color-coded there from various different points of view, as well as the brainstem and cerebellum hanging out on the bottom ventral, if you remember, ventral side of the brain, of the cerebrum, ventral to the cerebrum. Something else that we want to talk about with the brain is some internal stuff rather than that kind of external view. Let's think about what's going on inside the brain. And you surely have heard of gray matter and white matter before, but what are they? So as it turns out, gray matter is where we find neurons that, in terms of the neurons themselves, they're cell bodies, right? The white matter consists of their axons. So in the next chapter, we're going to get into a little bit more depth about cell bodies and axons. I'm going to hope that you remember some of the basics from intro psych here about what neurons look like. One of the things that you may have learned, if you remember, is that axons are coated with something known as the myelin sheath. And it's a fatty coating surrounding the axon that helps speeds up the nerve transmission signal. And it's really that fatty myelin sheath that gives the white matter its particular appearance. So when we think about the brain and the way it's organized, we want to keep in mind here that all of the cell bodies reside in the gray matter, and all of those axons are in the white matter. So there's a lot of back and forth connections happening between these two areas here. As mentioned, there are some cavities in the brain called ventricles that contain cerebrospinal fluid, and we do have some nerve fibers that interconnect the two halves of the brain, the two left and right hemispheres of the cortex, known as the corpus callosum. We can see some of all of that here. So again, we're now looking at a medial view, right? We've taken a frontal section, and we are looking at, we can see the gray matter, right? The gray matter is in the outer layers of the cortex, and that's where we're going to find a lot of neurons in terms of their cell bodies. Their axons, though, protrude down further into the interior parts of the cerebrum, where we see the white matter. You can also get a little view of the corpus callosum there, just a little bundle of nerve fibers, axons, right? Part of the white matter that interconnects the left and right sides of the brain. We see the ventricles there, right? Not much to remark about there. And we see the sulcus, right? We don't really need to care too much about the lateral sulcus, but it's labeled there, just as the temporal lobe is as well. It doesn't really matter too much for our purposes. Here, let's take that sagittal section here. So now that we look at this medial view, we have the, I think I said it wrong before, right? There was a frontal view. I mixed them up myself already. Now this has a medial view, and we can see, again, the cortex fairly well here. The corpus callosum is harder to visualize in this particular plane, so much better in the previous one, where you can see how it crosses between the two hemispheres. We see some additional ventricles, not too easily to visualize there. Again, maybe we don't care so much about where these ventricles are, but you can get a good view here of the brainstem and cerebellum in relation to the cortex. But you can get a sense here of some additional structures that sit above the brainstem, that is dorsal to the brainstem, but still ventral to the rest of the cortex. And so these are variously known as subcortical structures, or we will see also the diencephalon is another word that we can use for this. Now, what's the brain made out of? Well, we know about neurons, right? And of course, neurons are pretty important, and that's where we think all the action is when it comes to understanding cognition and sensory motor control, is all of the computational stuff that happens in neurons. And we have a lot of them. 80 to 100 billion is our best guess. Of course, no one really has ever sat down and counted all of the neurons in a brain, but you can get an idea based on doing some microscopic analysis of different parts of the brain to understand the density of neurons in specific regions, and then from extending there on out to the total volume of the brain. But the brain is not just neurons. The brain also contains glial cells, and glial cells do a lot of different things, right? Modulating neuron activity. So this is a job for a specific kind of glial cell called an astrocyte, which helps compose what we call the blood-brain barrier. The issue here is that we do not want the bloodstream coming into direct contact with neurons for a lot of reasons. One is, of course, that it prevents any sort of infectious disease that we might have in our bloodstream from getting into the brain. This could lead to a brain infection, which is a very serious health issue. So that's one good thing. Something else that's worth pointing out, though, is that part of what our body does to defend itself against infections is it produces white blood cells that recognize these foreign invading cells and destroy them. Well, as it turns out, white blood cells may not always recognize neurons as part of our own body. And if they were to come into direct contact with neurons, they might start attacking neurons, and we get some sort of inflammatory response in the brain, which again is not going to be a very good health condition for us. So astrocytes, what they do is they surround the blood vessels that feed the brain, and they extract all of the nutrients, primarily glucose, that the neurons need, and they relay the glucose to the neurons. And as the neurons do their metabolic business, they also produce waste. Of course, synaptic activity also produces waste as well, in the form of unused neurotransmitters. And that has to be cleaned up and then excreted into the veins so that it can be urinated. And so, of course, the astrocytes are doing this as well. So they are extracting nutrients from the arteries and also helping to excrete waste products into the veins that are all within the brain. But separately, we also have glial cells that provide sort of a structure that gives shape to the brain, especially these are especially important when the brain is first developing prenatally. So when we are an embryo and fetus and the brain is starting to form, the shape and structure of the brain is helped in part by the organization of certain glial cells. Something else the glial cells do is they help build the myelin sheath that surrounds axons. And so that's another important thing for the glial cells to do. There's even some evidence that, just as we already know that neurons communicate with each other, glial cells also communicate with each other. And this helps them do an efficient job of modulating brain activity in different parts of the brain to make sure that the resources that the brain needs, primarily all of this oxygenated glucose-rich blood, is going where it needs to go in the brain. And so the glial cells need to be able to, coordinate with each other to ensure that that happens. In a way, then, this means that the glial cells sort of function as kind of a second brain, right? Communicating with each other. We have 100 billion of those, and they're all interacting with each other and communicating with each other to modulate that brain function. So it's kind of a behind the scenes second brain, right? It's interesting to think about exactly what's happening there, because in truth, we only are really kind of scratching the surface of how much we know about what the glial cells really do when they communicate with each other. Let's see, we got a couple of more key anatomical names specific to the nervous system. So this will always confuse us a little bit more, because now we have a nucleus, but a nucleus means more than one thing here. Oftentimes we think of the nucleus as being that place inside of a cell that has all of the DNA and stuff like that, which of course remains true. But also, anytime we have a little cluster of neurons that all work together, we're going to call that a nucleus as well. Just a little cluster, a little group of neurons all functioning in to do some particular job. To make matters more confusing, a cluster of neurons that works together. It's called a nucleus only when they are found within the central nervous system. So in the brain and spinal cord, we may find nuclei in plural. But if we look into the peripheral nervous system, a little grouping of neurons would be called instead a ganglion rather than a nucleus. So in the previous chapter, when we talked about the evolution of simple brains that we referred to as a ganglion, that's because these particular early species really didn't have a meaningful distinction between a central and a peripheral nervous system. And so we just refer to that as a ganglion because it would be part of just what would really the peripheral system. It didn't have a central nervous system, right? And to further this difference, a different terminology for CNS and PNS, a nerve is a bundle of axons that's being transmitted through the peripheral nervous system. But when we see a bundle of axons in the brain or spinal cord, it's not called a nerve, it is called a tract. But they are essentially functionally the same thing, a bundle of axons traveling in the same direction, transmitting information as part of a functional unit. Here's an example of a picture of that, right? We know what axons are, hopefully. So here's just a very standard picture of two neurons communicating with each other. Neuron 1 organizes information within the cell body and transmits that down the axon where it connects to the dendrites of neuron 2. But if we imagine several neurons who bundle their axon fibers together, then we get a nerve if it's in the peripheral nervous system, or we get a tract if it's in the central nervous system. Speaking of the central nervous system, we're going to stop here. I think this is enough for one part of a lecture. We will come back for a part 2. If I can find my mouse, we will stop the share and call it a day here.